All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So you can find your seats. So, welcome to LitFest 2022. My name is Julia Marquez-Uppman. I'm a summer intern here at Lighthouse, and this is tonight's visiting author reading and conversation. I'm so happy to have you all here. So we'll be featuring 4 panelists tonight, but before I introduce everyone, just a couple quick announcements. If you are watching online, you are not on camera, you're not on mic, so please, if you have questions, submit them via the chat function. There's also links in there to our upcoming readings, as well as to the next event we have coming up, which is tonight's Lit Fest at Night reading, featuring Lighthouse faculty. That kicks off at 7:30 tonight, and it's free. For those of you here in person, whoa, yikes. The cross breeze is a problem. Thank you to everyone who pointed to me in shock. I'm fine. All right, so if you're here in person, please take phone calls and conversations outside. And please go ahead and save your questions for the end. We will have a Q&A opportunity at the mic over here to my left to ask questions of our readers. Finally, if you would like to purchase a book and have it signed by our readers tonight, please visit our pop-up bookstore from Matter. That's our LitFest book-selling partner this year. You can purchase your books there. We will be doing signing outside after the reading. Finally, if you're looking for more classes or workshops that still have space during LitFest, please check with the info booth. You can find a link to our cheat sheet there that has info about everything that still has space available. I'd like to thank SCFD, the National Endowment for the Arts, and Colorado Creative Industries for helping to make LitFest 2022 possible, in addition to York Street Yards for the generous use of this wonderful space. And finally, a special thank you to this reading's sponsor, the Mile High MFA at Regis University. We have a representative back here. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our first visiting author, Dean Bakopoulos. Dean Bakopoulos is the writer-in-residence at Grinnell College and the author of 3 novels. He's also co-writer and executive producer of the HBO Max series Made for Love, based on the novel by Alyssa Nutting, his wife and occasional writing partner. Dean received his BA from the University of Michigan and his MFA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The winner of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, Dean also reviews books for the New York Times Book Review and the San Francisco Chronicle. He divides his time between Iowa and Los Angeles with his wife and their 3 kids. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please welcome Dean Bakopoulos.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia, for the nice intro. Julia is my former student, a very promising former student at Grinnell College. So it's really fun to see her out in the literary world and to see all of you. This is the first in-person reading I've given in 3 years, so I'm just going to get right into it. I'm going to read a little snippet from a memoir in progress. The memoir is it gets surreal at times. I was telling a friend that it's a nonfiction book, but when things get emotional, I kind of make stuff up and go surreal. And he's like, "Isn't that a novel?" And I said, "Shut up." So we don't need to genre this. Is the sound okay? Am I too echoey or okay? All right. Really close? Yeah. I just tested negative, so I'll slobber all over this. Okay. This is called What I Did on the Moon. Well, I had some drinks. I yearned for you. I dug up my father's bones and watched them float off into the ether. I ignored my infirm mother. I engaged with various shadows. One night, I saw a light flickering below me. I went to a tower I'd crafted from rocks and climbed it so I could better see the light. It was coming from my house. My children were signaling to me. I went to the special crater I used for listening. I listened. I could hear their voices like so much mewing. I whispered into the whisper hole I made with a blowtorch. "Are you mewing for me?" I said. I waited to hear their voices, but they'd fallen asleep. I listened to their sleeping all night. I had memorized the sound of their sleeping. I could sing along to the smell of their breaths. I knew the scores of their dreams. When I was without my kids, I found the nearest people. It's what you do after a divorce. There are some people you think, I'll sit next to them. You're healing from a fracture. People see it when you say things like, "Hi, everybody." That's what I would say, sitting down at, say, Applebee's at the bar. Say, "Hi, everybody." I would say, "Hey, what are the app specials?" I would say, "Wow, check this out, mega mug of Miller, $4.99. The Applebee's often closed early on the moon. I had to find other resources to expand my circle of friends. On the moon, there is a swiping app that assists with this, with finding people to sit with, to sup with. Lo, I stand at the door and swipe, 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 swipe. One woman made me dinner. She made a pasta dish in an overly lemony sauce. I was 38 and having dinner with a woman I just met in her cluttered dining room. I kept thinking to myself how notable it was, and how her hair was piled on her head, how her earrings shimmied as she grated the Parmesan. What notable earrings! They were handmade, she said. Handmade, I said. By an artist, she said. An artist in Santa Fe. That's how we talked to each other. But it was also probably notable feeling that night because I was on the moon. I was skinny that year. I ate my pasta without self-consciousness. I don't ever want to be that skinny again. Jesus, yes, I do. Afterwards, I helped the woman do the dishes. She started the dishwasher and put on Sade, and I went for my keys, but she asked me to unzip her dress. This is no ordinary love. I hadn't dated since college, so I asked for clarification. All the way? I asked. She said. Is this a request for practical assistance before I leave for the night, I asked, or is this an invitation to stay? She said. I see, I said, and started to unzip the dress, then stopped. I'm sorry, I said, if I'm ruining the mood, but I need clarification. I didn't ask a yes-no question, but you keep saying, she said. Stop talking. Afterwards, I got up and went to start the shower. What are you doing? She called from the sweaty bed. Taking a shower, I said. And then I realized I was only taking a shower because this is what people did in movies after they slept with, let's face it, a stranger, which was a new experience for me. Isn't that what people do, I said? Shower? I was already in the shower, though, wet. There was nothing to undo. Maybe in the morning, she said. At night, most people either leave or sleep. I was fully lathered up by the time she said, "You know, I have to work in the morning." "Which one should I do?" I said, "leave or sleep?" I had to say this 3 times. "What should I do, leave or sleep?" Each time progressively louder. "What should I do, leave or sleep?" Because she couldn't hear me over the shower and the running water. It was a great shower. "What should I do, leave or sleep?" "You're in charge, boyo," she said. I left. I went back to my moon tower in the teetering rubble. The lights were off back home. I heard no noises through my whisper hole, no sleep songs or dream ditties. I drove a small motorbike on the moon, mainly to the market where I could buy some sundries with my dwindling funds. The shopkeeper looked exactly like my father, his thick accent, his mustache gone to gray, his refusal to extend credit. "I didn't know I would be up here," I said. "I have no provisions." "How much do you have?" he said. "I have a cinnamon stick and some dead flowers," I said. This was left over from a gift basket someone sent me, someone who needed something from me in the professional realm and felt sorry for asking at such a difficult time. But the good parts of that basket, the salami and almonds, were so long gone, I missed them like you might miss a dead pet. How ravenous I suddenly was. How sick of being skinny. We had a chuckle about this, me and the shopkeeper. You don't know what you got until you're wrong, he said. It's gone, I said. What's gone? He said. The saying, I said. It's not wrong, it's gone. Beggars can't be chosen, he said. In the end, I was allowed to take some dented cans from a dusty cart in the back of the store. The appearance of Chef Boyardee's cherubic face made me moan in gratitude. I'd known him my whole life. It felt like there was nobody else I had known my whole life. That can opener was a loner, and the shopkeeper stressed this. It's the only one on the moon, he said. This seemed hard to believe, but so is everything that year. Everything okay will be, he said. You have a good lawyer. Back at my camp, I lit the fire. Fire is blue and red on the moon. You don't even recognize it as fire. It looks like a sloshing liquid, like the slime my children make from glue and borax. Thinking of them with their bed heads making slime back home, though it wasn't my home anymore, made the wind blow harder. The slime fire keeps me warm, though. You don't expect to be on the moon for long, and these differences in things like fire are only tolerable for short durations. Eventually, you find yourself missing the crack of the hatchet, the smell of wood smoke, a shower of wayward sparks. Nobody came to visit. Sometimes acquaintances would float by awkwardly on their way to make photocopies or sweep up the rain. My lawyer kept trying to reach me. Their phones would ring and ring, but nothing. The phone would ring and ring, but nothing was audible once you picked it up. The flickering lights went on again one night, and I listened at my crater, but the whisper hole had become too clogged by debris. And I climbed my tower, but it was settling, more pile than pinnacle. I knew I had to build a ladder back to the earth, so I did. What a shitty ladder it was, unsafe and ugly to the eye. Those on the moon mocked and jeered at me as I lowered it. People whispered their doubts as I descended, all eyes on me. It'll never work, they whispered as I swayed precariously above the stratosphere. Nothing works, assholes, I shouted. Upon my arrival, I whistled for my friends. I whistled for my dog. I whistled for a taxi. None of these things came because I was in a cornfield, and the corn was taller than me. I came out of the field covered in moon dust. I looked up and down the road. I recognized nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. What an ethereal and hilarious reading. Not a common combination. Okay, our next author, Victoria Chang, is the author of Obit, which was named a New York Times notable book and received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, among other honors. Her nonfiction book, Dear Memory, was published in 2021, and her forthcoming book of poetry, The Trees Witness Everything, will be published this year. She has received a Guggenheim Fellowship and is a core faculty member within Antioch's Low Residency MFA program. Please welcome Victoria Chang.
Is it clean, Dean? Thanks for coming. I'm going to read some poems. Hold on, let me turn my timer on in case I don't want to do something terrible. So I wanted to thank Michael Henry, Andrea Dupre, Torin Jensen, and my awesome students, who some are here, some are there, maybe some over there, and all the people that have been driving me around all week. I really appreciate you. And it's such an honor to read with Dean and Ed and Melissa. I'm just going to read from three things and jump around a little bit. I'll start with some poems from my book, Obit, and there's really nothing necessary to know, but my mother passed away in 2015 of pulmonary fibrosis, and it's just a really awful disease where your lungs harden and then you gradually suffocate to death. And my dad had a stroke maybe about 15 years ago, and he just passed away in January, but he lost all of his language. And these are poems that are shaped in obituary shapes, and the form didn't come, they didn't come first. I figured the form out later. Music. Died on August 7th, 2015. I made a video with old pictures and music for the funeral. I picked Hallelujah in a cappella because they weren't really singing, but actually crying. When my children came into the room, I pretended I was writing. Instead, I looked at my mother's old photos, the fabric patterns on all her shirts, the way she held her hands together at the front of her body. In each picture, the small brown purse that now sits under my desk. At the funeral, my brother-in-law kept turning the music down. When he wasn't looking, I turned the music up because I wanted these people to feel what I felt. When I wasn't looking, he turned it down again. At the end of the day, someone took the monitor and speakers away, but the music was still there. This was my first understanding of grief. Thanks. My mother's teeth died twice, once in 1965, all pulled out from gum disease. Once again on August 3rd, 2015. The fake teeth sit in a box in the garage. When she died, I touched them, smelled them, thought I heard a whimper. I shoved the teeth into my mouth, but having two sets of teeth only made me hungrier. When my mother died, I saw myself in the mirror, her words around my mouth like powder from a donut. Her last words were in English. She asked for a Sprite. I wonder whether her last thought was in Chinese. I wonder what her last thought was. I used to think that a dead person's words die with them. Now I know that they scatter, looking for meaning to attach to, like a scent. My mother used to collect orange blossoms in a small, shallow bowl. I passed the tree each spring. I always knew that grief was something I could smell, but I didn't know that it's not actually a noun, but a verb, that it moves. That's really nice, but you don't have to do that every time. Friendships. Died June 24th, 2009, once beloved, but not consistently beloved. The mirror won the battle. I'm now imprisoned in the mirror, all my selves spread out like a deck of cards. It's true, the grieving speak a different language. I am separated from my friends by gauze. I will drive myself to my own house for the party. I will make small talk with myself, spill a drink on myself. When it's over, I will drive myself back to my own house. My conversations with other parents about children pass me on the way up the staircase and repeat on the way down. Before my mother's death, I sat anywhere. Now I look for the image of the empty chair near the image of the empty table. An image is a kind of distance. An image of me sits down. Depression is a glove over the heart. Depression is an image of a glove over the image of a heart. Rule breakers. I'm going to read a few miniature poems. I call them miniature poems because after writing a book like Obit, I was not wanting to write about anything. So I didn't know how to do that. So I gave myself a lot of constraints, of which one was just a bunch of syllabic rules from various Japanese forms, so like tankas and a whole bunch of other ones like kataudas and chokas. And then I also gave myself another constraint, which is to use W.S. Merwin's titles as titles of my poems. And they're really interesting titles. They're so open, and that's why I decided to do that. And usually I don't do that, like, set things up at the beginning, but I was really trying hard to do something different. So they're just really small poems. I'll just read a few. Far along in the story, once I sat in rain, opened my mouth to the sky. I yearned to be changed, but each drop was a small knife. At first I fainted, but when I woke up, all the ticking had gone and all the centuries were one. My choices no longer hurt. Losing a language. We were born with a large door on our backs. When will we know if it opens? Green fields. I was supposed to return to the fields daily. I haven't been there since birth. On some nights, I smell smoke that I think is God calling me. But when I follow it, there's just a clothesline with half a life clipped on it, drying in the sun. Prophecy. I want to believe that each of us has a note, that at the end of the year, the stars do turn off. There's so much suffering, but ask for proof, and I have none. Snowfall. We say the snow falls, but it really seizes. Because it is light, it takes 7 years to grab. By the time it does, the old wars are over, and my mother is dead. But it lands on the new wars, melts on a different mother. Still morning. No mornings are still. The newly dead move the most. They force flowers to dilate. The gods. The fact that leaves can't be put back on trees makes me think that you do not exist. The lovers. There is a wildfire starving on top of a lake. See how the water holds fire but cannot end it? We insist on love when all we want is mercy. And then I'm just going to read 2 new poems from a manuscript I just finished on the paintings and artwork of Agnes Martin. And if you don't know her work, they're gorgeous. 10 by 10 usually, huge canvases with just a lot of grids. They're all different, and I love them so much. But I wrote a whole bunch of poems based on those pieces. So this one's called, actually, maybe I skipped one. I'll just read 2. This one's called Untitled Number 9, 1995. Agnes only had 9 years to live. The angels must have begun to hover around her canvas like monkeys. This canvas has 9 white, thin strips between the red and blue ones. I've spent my life thinking about the blue ones, thinking they were the future. But the future was red all along. I sense something is ending, but I'm not sure what. Maybe it's the future. This morning, I looked at a large spider web above my car. When I returned 10 minutes later, the weaver was gone, the web dismantled, but my hands were still open. Maybe a life doesn't matter so much as the feeling it leaves behind, whether anyone receives the feeling or not. Maybe our goal is to spend all the light, since none of us asked to be born. And I'll read one more. And this is based on this really large, it's not a painting, she actually uses gold leaf, and it's at the MoMA in New York, and they're little grids in gold. It's really beautiful. It's called Friendship 1963. I came to the city so I could see gold. When I arrived, though, the leaves were gold too, and I became confused. I called the front desk 4 times. An angel answered each time. By the 3rd call, he ended with, "Talk soon." In the morning, a different man answered, and I burst into tears. On 53rd Street, small children kept on running into me. A father yelled so loudly at the boy on the scooter that I thought he knew I was carrying death on my back. By the time I arrived at the museum, there was a long line. The bald man in front of me kept turning around to look at me. I could tell by his forehead that he could hurt me. When I finally found the room, I was the only one in there. Everyone else was below me in the Picasso room. While I stared at the gold rectangles, 2 attendants talked about whether to work overtime and get paid time and a half. I wanted to tell them that there's no such thing as time, just time and a half. Sometime in the night, Ital Adnan had died. I had just seen her paintings the day before. The crowds were large, and I wondered whether our looking had accelerated her death. When I took a photo of Agnes's piece, I saw my dark reflection on the gold. I started counting the grids, but the bald man came up next to me. Suddenly, there were 2 dark shadows on the gold. I asked him to step away, but when he said no, it was Agnes's voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for that beautiful reading. All right, up next, joining us virtually, is Melissa Febos. Melissa Febos, hi, Melissa. Melissa Febos is the author of the memoir Whip Smart and 3 essay collections, Abandon Me, Girlhood, and Body Work, The Radical Power of Personal Narrative. A recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, MacDowell, Breadloaf, and others, her essays have appeared in the Paris Review, The Believer, McSweeney's Granta, Tin House, The Sun, and the New York Times Magazine. She's an associate professor at the University of Iowa, where she teaches in the nonfiction writing program. Please welcome Melissa Febos.
Thank you so much, Julia. I can't see anybody, so if something goes wrong, somebody tell me somehow. I wish I could be there with you all right now, but instead I'm in my room at the Catbird Hotel, and you think I would have tucked in that sheet from my hotel bed behind me, but that's not what I've been doing. I've just been sitting here listening to these beautiful readings. I am very grateful to the technology and to Andrea and Mike and Torin and Jenna and Julia and Jordan and everyone who helped me Zoom into my class this morning, and all of you for being here, and especially to my class for showing up for their work and themselves and each other this week. And it's an honor to be reading with these geniuses. So I'm going to read from an essay in Girlhood called Les Calanques. And it's an essay that combines the past and the present in what we sometimes call braided essays. And it sort of toggles between a time in my life when I was really bad at taking care of myself and a time when I was much better at it. And I'm going to mostly read from the past section, and then I'll zoom right ahead to the end for a moment so I don't leave you hanging in the scary past. In the summer of 2001, before my final semester of college, I got a job at the New Press, an independent leftist publisher whose list included works by Noam Chomsky, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Simone de Beauvoir. My job was to sit in the air-conditioned Manhattan loft and, among other light administrative tasks, respond to the novelists who often mailed us their entire printed manuscripts for consideration. Dear author, I would type, the New Press rarely publishes novels and never those by American authors. This fact was immediately obvious if one simply glanced at our catalog. Still, myself an aspiring novelist, I pitied them as I dropped their manuscripts into the recycling bin with a funereal thunk. Most mornings, I wandered through the cavernous storeroom with its 12-foot industrial shelves of books and selected 1 or 2 to read that day at my desk. If I liked a book especially, I brought it home in my purse. I still have my stolen copy of Studs Terkel's Working. It would have been a great job for the person I would have been if I had not been addicted to heroin. I was only 20, but already beyond the charmed phase of believing I could outsmart the drug. I had begun trying to stop and still thought I might be able to do so without help. Certainly my boyfriend, who'd been a junkie much longer than me, wasn't offering any. I'd moved to New York 2 years before under the mistaken impression that Boston and the boyfriend were my problem. My habit had followed me, and eventually so did he. When I got my first paycheck from the New Press, he waited with me in the icy lobby of a Fifth Avenue bank to cash it. As the sweat turned cold on our backs, my boyfriend sucked on a free lollipop and tried to convince me to buy dope with the money to find some cocaine for speedballs. The hard candy rattled against his teeth as he whispered in my ear. Sick of the cloying red smell, I left the teller and tucked the bills into my wallet. Stop it, I hissed. The inside of my arm was still bruised from our last binge, visible even through the makeup that I'd smeared there. I already sensed the crawly feeling in my skin that I'd come to recognize as the first sign of withdrawal, but I didn't want to use again. I wanted to spend my paycheck like a normal college student on a trip or books or my credit card debt. As we pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped onto the steamy sidewalk, I shouted at him, "We're fucking junkies. It's not okay." He rolled his eyes and spat the cardboard stick onto the concrete. "Stop being dramatic." A week later, I quit my job and spent my entire second paycheck on a one-way ticket to Paris. The only luggage I'd brought was my backpack. When I landed at the airport at midday, I carried it off the plane, groggy with sleep. The airport teemed with people, a cloud of cigarette smoke wafting over their heads. Just as an aside, you were still allowed to smoke in airports at this point. It didn't get outlawed until like 2008. Good times. I pulled a pack of parliaments out of my pocket and lit one, and then followed the signs toward the exit. Using my guidebook and the free map of the Paris metro, I found my way to the first hostel on my list. The drab building was on a residential street, and the woman at the front desk ignored me until I began speaking. As soon as I struggled for a word in French, she interrupted me in English. After I'd paid, she led me to a room with bunk beds lining the walls, barrack style. The afternoon light filtered weakly onto the floor from a small window. I thanked her and climbed the metal ladder to the bunk that she indicated. I didn't want to waste the francs on a locker, so I stuffed my backpack under the pilled blanket between my legs and struggled to find a comfortable position to sleep. My body ached with exhaustion, but worse, a kind of loneliness that transcended that of a 20-year-old in a strange country, which can be acute in its own way. Here I was, not dope sick, 5,000 miles away from my life. I should have felt free. It is a particularly crushing disappointment to realize again that your problem is yourself. The chasm of despair that I'd felt in New York was still with me. Maybe it was in me. Maybe I thought it was me. That is the fear that every addict, every person who hates themselves shares. The terrible possibility that what torments you, what you loathe in yourself, is the truest part of you, the singed and poisonous center that can never be scraped out. I had no long history of suicidal thoughts, but back in my Brooklyn bedroom, I had a packet of razor blades tucked between my mattress and the box spring. I didn't plan to use them, but I found relief in the tangible reminder that there was always one more way out. In that hostel bed, I thought about those blades, their smooth silver faces and perfect edges. It was a comfort, like searching in the dark of a theater for the red glow of an exit sign. It was still dark outside when I woke in the hostel bed. The occupant of a nearby bunk gently snored. I located my bag wedged against the wall and found that I was wildly thirsty. I prodded my misery to see if it was still there, and it was, transmitting its hopeless report like a TV left on while I slept. I carefully peeled the blanket off me and slipped my arms through the backpack straps. Fearing thieves, I had slept in my shoes. I climbed down the bed's metal ladder, past the sleeping lump of my unknown bunkmate. In the restroom, I gulped water straight from the tap and avoided the mirror. When I left through the unmanned lobby, the door locked behind me. I had no idea where I was, and it didn't really matter. I walked for an hour until the street lamps flicked off and sunlight began to spill down the narrow alleys. I'd never seen buildings that looked like these, each corner so detailed as if it had been carved by hand, which they probably were. The yeasty smell of baking bread wafted from shops with their doors still locked. My mouth watered, but like a body won't forget its injury, my mind never forgot its pain. The scenery felt doused in loneliness. Foreign beauty is of no comfort to the homesick. At its core, maybe every despair is marked by a longing to find a home in oneself. I crossed the Seine on a pedestrian bridge and stopped in the middle to look down at the glimmering water. It was gray like the light, though the air was already warming. I imagined sinking into it, the cool quiet slipping over my mouth and eyes. By 9 a.m., I had reached the Arc de Triomphe. The monument sits at the intersection of 12 avenues that radiate from its center in an asterisk. I stared up at the limestone behemoth, its sculpted pillars that commemorate the victories of Napoleon, who commissioned it in 1806. When I was little and felt overwhelmed by my own feelings, I used to go to the beach and stare out at the Atlantic. Beside it, I felt so small, so odd. I was inconsequential and thus free. The ocean didn't care about my feelings, and it would be there after they passed, after my whole life passed. Standing under that 100-foot arch, I searched for that feeling, but found nothing. My problem was not one of perspective, at least not only, and could not be relieved by a shift in scale. I stared down at my travel guide, which assured me that there was a hostel just a few blocks from here that I hoped would be an improvement on the previous nights. On my way, I stopped at a small grocery to buy a bottle of water. As I approached the counter, the man in front of me turned to leave. For a moment, our eyes met. He was tall and lean, the fabric of his white t-shirt darkened by sweat under his arms. Beads of it gathered in the hollow of his neck, despite the relative cool of the shop. His face was handsome, but haunted, and from his eyes hung dark circles and a look that I instantly recognized. The moment passed and he brushed by me, hurried into the street. I had only a few seconds to decide. I abandoned my bottle of water beside the register and followed him out the door. Attendez, I called after him. Monsieur, attendez, s'il vous plaît. The stranger glanced over his shoulder and I waved, jogging to catch up with him. I groped in my mind for the right words to ask him what I wanted. Pouvez-vous en obtenir pour moi aussi? I asked, hoping it was close enough to, can you get me some too? He shook his head in confusion or feigned confusion and walked faster to lose me. Attendez, I pleaded. I have money. I dug in my pocket and pulled out a fold of bills. He stopped and half turned toward me. Pour vous aussi, I promised, holding out the money. He studied my face. I nodded and held his gaze long enough for him to recognize in me what I had seen in him. Finally, his shoulders dropped and he beckoned. Allons-y. So now I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs from the end of this essay. And this sort of hank of the present is at least 50% of the essay. And there's a bunch of research about cicadas, which I will not bore you with, but I reference it here. I came here with a list of things to write, but these memories keep returning. Instead of writing the things I intended, I write about the last time I was in this country. The more I write, the more I remember. I spend so much time with that younger self, her savage despair and fleeting reliefs, that I start to feel as though she is here with me. In the moments after waking, when I blink in the quiet, my body still as the tide of dreams recedes, I sense her there, like a language I can't speak, but have not forgotten. While I type at my desk, she slumps on the couch, flipping through my journal. In the afternoon, she trails me into the kitchen and watches me slice vegetables against my hand with the dull paring knife. As I swim my daily lap across the water, she waits on the shore with the other young women, their bodies soft and unmarked, perhaps hated like hers. I strike a match to light the stove and see her face aglow, the shadows hung beneath her eyes, the shine of her cheeks. I heat a bowl of soup and read a novel while I eat it, her eyes following mine across the pages. We are like cicadas, I want to tell her. When we rise from the ground, we shed our old bodies, but we don't forget them. We call the thing we need until it answers. Sometimes the one who finds us is a surprise. If we're lucky, we don't die. We get to live for a while inside that new life. At night, we crawl into the bed and let them sing us to sleep. Our bodies curl in identical parentheses, make of the rough white sheet a palimpsest. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Our final reader tonight is Edward Hirsch. A MacArthur Fellow, he has published 9 previous books of poetry, including Gabriel, a poem, a book-length elegy for his son. He has also published 7 books of prose, among them How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, a national bestseller. He has received numerous prizes, including the National Book Critics Circle Award. A longtime teacher at Wayne State University and in the creative writing program at the University of Houston, Hirsch is now president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Please welcome Edward Hirsch.
I'm very overstimulated. I forgot how to be with people. Thanks for those terrific readings. Thanks to all of you. I'm going to begin. Can you hear me okay? No. It's good to see you, Torin. How's that? Better? No. Better? Better? Okay. Okay, this is going to be exciting. I'm going to begin by reading you a few sections from my book-length poem about my son, Gabriel. It's a whole book, so these are just a few excerpts. It'll give you a feeling for it, for him. The population of his feelings could not be governed by the authorities. He had reasons why reason disobeyed him and voted him out of office. Anxiety, his constant companion, made it difficult to rest. Unruly party of one. Forget about truces or compromises. The barricades will be stormed. Every day was an emergency. Every day called for another emergency meeting of the cabinet. In his country, there were scenes of spectacular carnage. Hurricanes welcomed him. He adored typhoons and tornadoes, furies unleashed, houses lifted up and carried to the sea, uncontained, uncontainable. Unbolt the doors, fling open the gates. Here he comes, chaotic wind of the gods. He was trouble, but he was our trouble. We took him to Arlington Park Racetrack, but they wouldn't let him in the clubhouse because he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He disappeared, and in 10 minutes he came back wearing a button-down, a tie, and a blue blazer. He stopped by with a dozen incense candles. You don't even like incense, Lori said. It didn't matter. He had gotten them for free. He bought 10 cheeseburgers for $10 on the dollar menu at McDonald's and threw 6 of them away. He bought a 6-pack of beer into the common room of the nursing home to watch a football game with my mother, because everyone needs a good beer, especially the guy on the ventilator and the nurses who work too hard. He said the countryside made him feel nervous. He wanted a 24-hour kind of city. He woke me up at 2 a.m. to take a walk. He needed to talk. Lori pulled me back into bed. He had flat feet and an awkward gait. He didn't like to dance. He liked to go to raves and chill with friends. He couldn't pay attention, but his meds made him feel sleepy, and he sold them to college kids. He liked to kick back and remember the time we were riding home in a taxi cab on the West Side Highway, and my mother offered to take him to a strip club for his 21st birthday. What's wrong with that, she wanted to know. Why couldn't they celebrate together? That's just what you want, he bellowed, going for a lap dance with Grandma. He liked to kick back and declare he wanted to track down his birth mother to see if he really had Celtic blood. He liked to kick back and tell my family about the time he saw an American Hasidic Jewish reggae musician at Hampshire College. He saw Nicolas Cage going up an escalator in a movie theater and turned to his friends. I hate Nicolas Cage. He has such a big head. He liked to kick back and tell us how much he liked weed and shrooms. How bad could it be for you, he said. It comes out of the ground. He liked to kick back and roll a spliff with his friends at night. He always liked to go higher and higher. We're here, he'd say, lifting his hand to the middle of his chest, but we need to go here, he continued on, and raised his hand up to his neck. The whole time I was writing my poem for Gabriel, I kept trying to find a metaphor for grief. and I hoped it would come to me, and finally it did. I did not know the work of mourning is like carrying a bag of cement up a mountain at night. The mountaintop is not in sight because there is no mountaintop. Poor Sisyphus grief. I did not know I would struggle through a ragged underbrush without an upward path because there is no path. There's only a blunt rock with a river to fall into, and time with its medieval chambers, time with its ragged edges and blunt instruments. I did not know the work of mourning is a labor in the dark we carry inside ourselves. Though sometimes when I sleep, I'm with him again, and then I wake. Poor Sisyphus grief. I am not ready for your heaviness cemented to my body. Look closely, and you will see almost everyone carrying bags of cement on their shoulders. That's why it takes courage to get out of bed in the morning and climb into the day. Thank you. And now I'd like to read you a few poems from a book called Stranger by Night. It begins with an epigraph which I translated from a poet named Niconitis in the 3rd century BCE. This is the only poem of his. I think it's so beautiful. Traveler, I am the grave of Baitan. If you go from Tyrone to Amphipolis, give Nicarachus this message. His only son died in a storm in early winter before sunrise. My friends don't get buried. My friends don't get buried in cemeteries anymore. Their wives can't stand the sadness of funerals, the spectacle of wreaths and prayers, tear-soaked speeches delivered from the altar, all those lies and encomiums, the suffocating smell of flowers filling everything. No more undertakers in black suits clutching handkerchiefs, old buddies weeping in corners, telling off-color stories, nipping shots. No more covered mirrors, black dresses, skull caps, and crucifixes. Sometimes it takes me a year or two to get out to the backyard in Sheffield or Fresno, those tall ashes scattered under a tree somewhere in a park, somewhere in New Jersey. I am a delinquent mourner stepping on pine cones, forgetting to pray. But the mourning goes on anyway because my friends keep dying without a schedule, without even a funeral, while the silence drums us from the other side. The suffocating smell of flowers fills everything, always. The darkness grows warmer, then colder. I just have to lie down on the grass and press my mouth to the earth to call them so they would answer. The black dress. I don't know why I opened her book almost randomly on a whim. It signaled me from the shelf after all these years, like a burning black dress tangled in the branches. Her dress. She was the one who was burning. And that's when the letter fell out, a love letter, sort of, after we'd given up on each other, or did we? Our impossibility. And suddenly it came back to me in a rush, that night in Boston, a restaurant on the harbor, a storm simmering outside, that slinky black dress she was wearing. I didn't know she was burning inside of it. I thought it was the coming storm, summer lightning. I didn't know I was turning the pages of her book, her body, which I would read so closely. I wanted it so desperately. She was the fire. I didn't know she was already mourning for her childhood in the orchard, her lost self. Forgive me. I didn't know she was burning when she took off that black dress. This is a poem from when I worked on the railroad as a kid. The brakeman. He had a metal plate welded into the right side of his head from a drunken bar fight that he lost one night in 1963 outside the clearing yard, where he taught me how to separate freight cars at the top of the hump and switch them onto different tracks, chasing the runaways and scampering up the ladder to set the brakes and stop the bastards in their tracks, parking their bodies in the rust-colored air long enough to recouple, reroute, and reload them for shipping to Iowa or Nebraska or Colorado, the state of his retirement, the wide-open country where it's possible to see for hundreds of miles and think clearly again and breathe like a free man in the mountains. So you see my trick. I'm making a bid to be a Colorado writer. That was my only chance. A small tribe. I tried to see if I could write a history of my family in one sentence. The legend of a small tribe who crossed the steppes to become Eastern European eyeglass grinders with weak eyesight, horse traders, deserters from the Russian army, peddlers, impractical merchants, men who cried at the sad stories of women in tenements, who made their mothers laugh over steaming cups of coffee at the kitchen table, social democrats who argued with anarchists and communists, Zionists who never traveled to Zion, failed businessmen who snuck into Carnegie Hall to hear Rubinstein playing Chopin, and then stood on a soapbox in Union Square shouting for justice in the Spanish Civil War, who loved used bookstores and the musty back stacks of old libraries, but started a drugstore in Rochester, or sat on his suitcase waiting for the train to misfortune, selling shirts on Maxwell Street, asthmatics, non-assimilators, whose daughters married developers who never developed, and scrap metal dealers looking for an honest advantage, a gambler who beat the house and lost everything 3 times, a box salesman who could not contain himself, a scribbler. My favorite was a daydreamer who bought a new hat every year for Passover so that he could stand outside the temple, which he refused to enter, though he loved the songs and wanted to be close to the prayers. Thank you. So this is for us. It's called The Guild. It's a kind of ode to all the people that you spend your life trading poems with. You get to be a certain age, and a lot of them start dying off on you. And just realize you've spent your life working with them. So this is the group. We're part of it. Goodbye to the years we spent leaning over badly typed poems in cramped studies and dank hotel rooms, half crazed, inconsolable, constantly jabbing pencils at each other, brooding, smoking on the balcony across from a temple on the other side of the river one night in Rome, loyal or disloyal to the old gods, our flawed mentors, our weakness for standing at the podium seeking applause, slashing lines, reciting Blake or Yeats, giving up sleep for late night sessions, listening to Coltrane, and gossiping about new books and poets who've been dead for centuries, facing each other knee to knee or sitting side by side over each fresh draft, furiously arguing about this enjambment or that illusion, mysteries of craft, the muse, our shoulders touching, our voices growing hoarse with laughter, or walking out to the pier a few yards from the sea so that we could stand there together under the stars, alone with the abyss. Stranger by night. After I lost my peripheral vision, I started getting sideswiped by pedestrians cutting in front of me, almost randomly, like memories I couldn't see coming, as I left the building at twilight, or stepped gingerly off the curb, or even just crossed the wet pavement to the stairs descending precipitously into the subway station. And I apologized to every one of those strangers jostling me in a world that had grown stranger by night. And now I'm going to give you the 2-poem warning. A baker swept by. You were already losing your eyesight last winter in Rome when you paused in the doorway at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning and a baker swept by on a shiny bicycle, waving a cap and singing under his breath. You didn't know bakers wore white aprons dusted with flour and floated around the city like angels on a freshly baked day. You weren't sure why morning halted up and down the street as you stood in the doorway and a baker winged by on a weekend morning so new and pristine that you looked into the sky and for one undiminished instant of misplaced time, you saw brightness everywhere before a shadow crossed the rooftops and it was blotted out. Don't write elegies. Don't write elegies anymore. Let someone else stumble past the mausoleum and grieve under the calm shade of a plane tree, wiping away the tears of his ex-wife, staining the knees of his black suit, first sobbing, then choking back sobs, comforting others, consoling himself by scrubbing the white stone and weeding the plot year after year. I'm sorry, it's too sad. It's time for someone else to mourn my dead. Though who else can do it? I just need to lie here a while longer, face down in the soil, and then get up and breathe. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's have another round of applause for all of our incredible readers. And I'll invite them to join me up here on stage. Melissa, if we can see you again, that would also be great. Yeah. So if folks have questions, I invite you to line up over here at the microphone to the right. To ask those questions there. Folks watching online, please put your questions in the chat. Let me see a couple folks maybe. So I do have a question to start off. Nobody else has one. This comes from Melissa Febos' essay, Mindfuck. So in that essay, Melissa, you talk about punching through the false bottom, meaning writing past the story that we already know and into a deeper truth. You write, perhaps all the writing I love best began as a shallower version of itself, glib and tidy, a theater of types in which we cast ourselves in the role we wish we had played or the one we were prescribed, a doorway into the truer and more interesting story. So my question is based on Melissa's essay, but it's for all of our panelists. I wanted to ask about moments in your own writing when you have encountered a false bottom, a story that sat on the surface in some way, and what you did to punch through it.
Feel free.
Melissa?
Not making this easy.
Okay. I feel like I've already spoken on the topic now. Thank you for sharing those things that sound smarter than anything I'm going to say right now. I will say, there's an example that I gave my workshop this morning because we were talking about this very thing. We have been talking about it this week. And, it sort of goes back to what You know the quote on the Percival's quote on the totes that says like the writing is smarter than us, or something to that effect. It's kind of like that where, for me, I was specifically talking this morning about one of the essays in my second book, Abandon Me, where I was sort of writing while I was inside of an experience, a relationship that I was trying to make work. And I was writing it as a love story. And there was just like this moment when I was near the end, or what I thought was the end. And I just sunk like all the way into my writing experience where I sort of forgot myself. Like I had that beautiful kind of self-forgetting where I was like utterly unself-conscious and just like in the work. And I understood with like perfect clarity like that it was not a love story. And in fact, the narrator needed to leave her girlfriend and it was like a totally different kind of story. And I was like, whoa, that was weird. Never mind going back to writing my happy ending. But I couldn't get out of my head. And in that way, like the writing has been a kind of crystal ball. And eventually like that little princess in the pea, like grain of sand got to me enough. And another reader got to me enough and said like, you need to be more honest about what this story is actually about. And then I had to revise my way into the truth.
Thank you so much. If folks have questions, I invite you to head over to our microphone there. Would anybody else like to talk about their own false bottoms?
Oh, you
Maybe
mean
not.
us?
Yeah, you
Okay.
guys.
I mean, this is just not a language that's familiar to me. I just
Sure.
don't think of false bottoms in poetry. It's just not, that's just not the way I think of writing and what it is. I think the equivalent of what would be a false bottom would be there's a lot blocking us from telling the truth in our poems. No one really wants us to, certainly not the people that we're close to. And so it takes a kind of ruthlessness. And there's a way in which your consciousness or your super consciousness, or your super ego tries to block you from being ruthless enough to tell the truth. And I think a lot of the work of writing poetry is to try to get past that. I don't think it's what I would call a false bottom. I think it's a kind of relentless scrutiny that it takes to write poems. And I believe that at least in writing anything, but really I'm just going to talk about writing poetry, I think it takes technique, but it also takes courage. And the courage is being willing to face what you don't really want to face. And I think it's like psychoanalysis, you're supposed to go where it's difficult. And I think that's the case in pretty much every poem that one writes. And the challenge of it is to get to what it's really, what you really need to say and what it's really about.
Thank you. I see we have somebody here who'd like to ask a question. Oh, can you get a little closer to the mic there?
Yes. Is that better?
That's better.
I wanted to ask about your private experience of the pandemic. And I think one way to ask it would be, how did the pandemic change your writing? But I keep trying to figure out a more intelligent way to ask this question. I think it's how did your writing practice teach you about what your experience of the pandemic really was?
Well, I mean, we'll all answer this, but
Yeah.
why don't you go ahead?
All right. I mean, I think for me, the pandemic was not really challenging compared to other people. So I felt so lucky at first because I had income, I had place, a space. I was with my kids, we were healthy. But I didn't do any writing. It seems silly to me. And it wasn't because the pandemic was as horrible as it was. It was more just a fatigue with reality. And I think that change in the piece you heard was the beginning of that, where like I just could not do straight nonfiction anymore. So I think that was the biggest change for me. I had been working on a memoir that was straight, and it felt forced, and it felt like a book full of self-pity, which I think is a sin a lot of writers fall into. And so for me, I guess the only real tangible thing I could say that came out of that was having the space and the solitude. I mean, there were some very lonely, sad times too, obviously, where I think along with a lot of my friends and maybe the culture at large, vulnerability was no longer something I was afraid of. So I don't know, I just became a much more vulnerable person for it. And I think you can see it in the work I started to do during the pandemic, was just a real raw confessional that had to twist reality to make sense. If that I couldn't capture the emotional in any sort of clinical or realistic terms. So I kept everything I tried to write that was nonfiction would veer into the surreal. And I think the pandemic maybe helped me embrace it, because it felt like we were in a sort of half reality. It didn't feel like real life anymore to a lot of us.
Everyone's looking at me. I feel eyes on both sides staring at me. I love self-pity. I want to relate it to what Ed was saying too. It's like, I think that's so true, is anything that's really embarrassing, or I love writing it into, underneath, above, toward shame. I feel so much shame on a daily basis and in my life, and things that I'm embarrassed about, feelings that I feel, that I try really hard to write toward that. But it's really difficult because it's embarrassing. So, but if you can make art out of those feelings, I feel like that's authenticity, and that's being honest. And that's what Ed was referring to, is how do you find the truth of what it means to be human. And yeah, it's very hard to do, but you have to almost not write toward an audience, not think about what you're doing for anyone else, but do it for yourself, because it's a really difficult, joyful experience, actually. In terms of the pandemic question, I mean, I'm a little different, because I gained like 2.5 or 3 hours a day. I live in Los Angeles. We were just talking about that, Alex, who drives 10 times per month? No, a year. Alex lives in New York. I live in Los Angeles. I drive 10 times a day. And so I gained about 3 hours a day. And so I wrote a lot, and it saved my life in many ways. And I actually loved it so much because I discovered how much I haven't written my whole life. And so that was really, it meant a lot to me. And I don't know, I kind of resent that question, because I'm like, we're still in the pandemic. So yeah, anyway, I'll let Ed answer it. I'll stop talking now.
You changed me with the idea that you love self-pity. Now I'm going to say I love it too. I had a very specific thing that I was doing during the pandemic, in addition to my job, which I was running a foundation from a small bedroom in my partner's house. I had a commission to write a book for the Library of America on 40 American poems, and it was going to be just a reading of 40 different poems from the history of American poetry. But I was so upset, like everyone in the country, and I didn't know what I could do, and I thought what I can do is think about poetry. And so I decided to write this book, which is now called The Heart of American Poetry. And I tried very, very specifically to cheer myself up by thinking about American poetry and what distinguishes it from all the other poetries. And I tried to rethink American poetry in light of 3 viruses: COVID-19, that had shut down the entire world, and the reemergence of systemic racism, which was more virulent than I had quite realized, and an authoritarian threat to democracy that it was unprecedented in my time and that I didn't think was real. And I wanted to see what American poetry had to say about that, starting with oral Native American poems, and then moving to Anne Bradstreet, and then Phyllis Wheatley, brought over as a slave, and just rethinking about the threads that run into American poetry and the narratives that people have told about American poetry and how diminished they are and how limited. And so this was, for me, if you can say anything like this during a pandemic, extremely exciting to sort of hearten myself at such a disheartening time by thinking about what our contribution was to world literature. And one of the things I came up, I mean, I could talk a lot about this, so I won't say too much about it, but I'll just say that I came up with the idea that American poetry, as part of American literature, is a kind of family. It's a difficult family. My sister thought this was hilarious because I compare the family to a gathering at Thanksgiving where people storm off in different directions. She goes, wonder where you got that idea. So, and in the introduction to this book, I write about Walt Whitman's poem, I Hear America Singing. And I make the argument that no one had ever stood at street level and described common people the way that Walt Whitman had done before, and that this is a premise and promise of American literature. But does it actually hold? And can we keep that promise? And that America is a country of broken promises. And I follow this with Langston Hughes's poem, I Too. And the poem begins, I too sing America. But it's not just singing America, it's a conversation with Walt Whitman, saying, you made a promise, and I'm going to make a corrective to include us in this promise. And then he says, I am the darker brother. And this is what gave me the idea that it's a family. Because he doesn't say, I am your enemy. He doesn't say, I have nothing to do with you. He says, I am your darker brother. And you may not want to include me at the table, but you will be forced to, because this is part of what the family is. And so I talk about the way American poetry continues to revise itself and rethink itself to hold us to a kind of ideal, which is an American ideal, which is that all people are created equal. And that it seems really important from our side of the street, the poetry side of the street, that America keeps holding itself to this ideal. And so this was exciting to me because it reminded me that there's a kind of promise about America that still is real at a time when it just seems that we're just filled in a country with broken promises. So it felt like I could contribute by talking about what poetry's contributed to the American conversation.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, everybody. Oh, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. I was wondering, for those of you that write in multiple formats or structures, how you switch between them, like poetry to memoir or memoir to screenwriting. I'm curious to hear your process there, because I personally find it really difficult to switch between different types of writing.
I'll lead again, unless Melissa wants to lead. But all right. Melissa, you're over my head, so I keep looking over my shoulder at your head. I mean, for me, I never have felt really like, I fell in love with language as a kid. My parents were both immigrants, and I was raised mainly by my mom and my maternal grandparents from Ukraine who were refugees. And so like we were a family that talked about exile a lot. We were never going to be home. And that was the dominant mode of writing. So I'm taking this in a slightly different direction, but my sense is like I have never felt like my voice belonged to a genre. It was all like, when I was growing up, all the songs and poetry were just pure emotion. So I really, no matter whether I'm writing a TV script, which seems really formulaic, or a memoir or a novel, I even do poems that I don't show people. Like, it always starts with emotion, even if it's the opening of a screenplay, which seems like a very formulaic writing. And like, that's just how I learned what art was. It was this overwhelming emotion that would come out, at the Sunday dinner table, or would come out at church, or would come out when my grandma had too much to drink. And you just would feel that swell. And no matter what genre I write in, it starts with the swell. It starts with something that is going to burst out. And so I feel like I really like moving between stuff, and everything I write, though, starts in a place of usually a character in exile, character who's been forced out or lost their way. I only realized that recently, so I think it always comes from that for me.
I think we have time to hear from one more person, then we'll have to wrap up. If anyone else has anything to add. Melissa, any thoughts? They're peering over their shoulders at you.
Okay. Yeah, I will say that similar to Dean, I start with the same kind of thing, like a feeling. It's usually an emotional starting point or a mood or, some sort of inner conflict or projection of an inner conflict. But I will say formally, I write secret poems, but I wouldn't even talk about those. But between fiction and nonfiction, my experience of fiction is that it feels a little bit like a circus tent that I've raised with my imagination. And I'm sort of like walking around and discovering and exploring and like following characters. But it's a little bit perilous because if I have a crisis of faith, the whole tent collapses. And I often have crises of faith. So there's a lot of like reconstruction that happens in fiction. And therefore it takes a really long time. And it also takes a really long time because I'm like a Libra all over my chart. And so making decisions is really hard for me. And so there are a lot of decisions to make in fiction. And with nonfiction, I think I find the constraint of nonfiction really liberating because I have this sort of finite material. Even if it is plentiful, it's still like pretty finite in what I can access in my memory and what I can find in research. And it becomes a kind of puzzle to sort of answer the question or articulate the feeling with a finite set of materials. And that just feels a little bit safer. I can get to work faster in that way, which is why I still haven't finished this novel, but I've written like 4 nonfiction books.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you to all of our panelists. Let's give them another round of applause. So that concludes tonight's Visiting Author reading. If you'd like to sign books, we'll be doing that out back. Please feel free to stick around for our Lit Fest at Night reading featuring our Lighthouse faculty. Thanks again, everyone. Books are available to be signed. You can purchase them at our Matter bookstore.